Welcome to the last session of the program, followed by cocktails, by the way, so don't leave. And that's a session on a subject very close to my heart, namely the role of local governance and local governments in the overall space of development planning. We have a very good panel, I think, a very strong panel, with people who can talk about this issue both from a Ministry of Finance, fiscal policy perspective, and people who can talk about this space from a local urban planning and local governance perspective. But I'm not going to introduce the speaker. I'll leave that to the moderator of the last session, my colleague Farzana Ahmed. I wish you a pleasant last session.
Well, good afternoon to this last and very interesting session that we're going to be having on the role of subnational government and regional planning. So this session actually follows quite nicely from the last session on regional cooperation, because we're really going to be talking in the context of a country itself. So, as previous speakers have mentioned, the Asia-Pacific region has experienced a rapid growth in the last 10 years. But with that has brought the challenges of ensuring that the benefits of the growth actually accrue to all the citizens of the country, and in particular ensuring that we have effective and efficient service delivery to the citizens of the country. So the role of subnational governments is becoming increasingly important, and this has raised an issue about how they can be effective conduits for this more effective service delivery. But with that has brought the issues of capacity development. How can national governments be relied upon to deliver service delivery when there are challenges of capacity in terms of both managing the funds and in terms of human resources? There are the challenges of fiscal equalization. We have huge income disparities between countries and economic disparities between regions of the countries. So how can the central government ensure through fiscal equalization measures that the financial resources are available to all? And then there's the issue of how much diversity should there be allowed to subnational governments at the same time in trying to ensure that there is unity within the country. And then with subnational, with the rise in rapid urbanization, the question then arises, how do we balance issues of economic development with issues of the challenges to the environment? So to help answer some of these questions, we have a very respected panel here, and I'd like to just briefly introduce them before going to questions. Mr. Boonchai Charassaangsomboon, who's the International Economic Advisor to the Fiscal Office of Thailand. Lauren Sorkin, who is the Regional Director of 100 Resilient Cities, which is a program that is pioneered by the Rockefeller Foundation. Kim McQuay, who is the Managing Director of the Special Project Group for the Asia Foundation. And Sakon Varani Watana, who is the Professor of Economics at the Faculty of Economics at Thammasat University. So I might begin with Boonchai. Now you've held various roles in the Fiscal Affairs Office in the Government of Thailand. You're also a member of the board of the Asia Infrastructure Bank and have represented Thailand, of course, as in the World Bank as well. So I might put to you the issue, the question of fiscal equalization. So what has been Thailand's experiences in being able to ensure fiscal equalization and the challenges, and in particular if you could touch on the issues of tax reform?
Thank you, Farzana. I don't know if you're here. Yes, thank you. Before we talking about the fiscal equalizations, let me start my field on the inclusiveness. It is a general acceptable right now that when we talk about economic growth, it doesn't mean the growth itself, but it must be inclusive as well. So in this sense, the Minister of Finance is still commit itself. When they have measures, when they have prepare the tax reform, we aim to push to that direction. So I personally also would like to reiterate that the issue of inclusiveness is very important and very imperative issues of the current global development agendas. As you may already know, that under the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, every country has to adjust themselves to accommodate their development policy towards SDGs. Thailand is not exception. Right now, the Thai government is planning to align their development policies towards that goal, those goals. For example, right now the government tried to set up 20 years development goals under the current government to make it more smooth and sustained in terms of the targets. So I think that is the key basics framework that every country has to adjust to. For the case of Thailand, when we talk about inclusiveness, you cannot deny that local government's roles in terms of promoting inclusiveness is very important. These local government services are vital to build up quality of our manpower in the futures. So in this sense, I think that we have to strengthen their capacities to ensure that our people, wherever they live, can benefit from government services. So these kinds of services are quite important in terms of capacity buildings of our future manpowers. So in this sense, public service at local level are so important to promote inclusiveness in the longer run, as local administrations in general can better respond to local preference than central government. So to fulfill this expected role, local government must have enough revenue to cover with their cost of services. And for that, balanced budget between revenue and expenditures is therefore an ideal solution to all governments. This condition will safeguard local governments' independence to a certain level. Now, let me turn to the case of Thailand. The issue of promoting the decentralization functions had been long discussed, but not until when we have the new constitutions of 1999, which clearly stipulated that administrative decentralization to local governments must be ensured. And as a result, 2 years later, the government issued the determining plan and process of decentralization to Local Government Organization Act of 1999 to govern the directions of the country's decentralization process. And in that same year, under the law, we have entrusted a decentralization committee. The name is quite wrong. The Decentralization to Local Government Administration Committee. I will call it Decentralization Committee in short. This committee will be the driving body for Thailand decentralization of government service and public service. Under the law, we call government administration local government administration organization, we characterize into 5 categories. The first one is provincial administration organization. The second one is municipal administrations. The third group is sub-district administration organization. The fourth one is the Bangkok Metropolitan. And the last one is the city of Pattaya. These 5 categories are local administration organization under the law definitions. So when the law first enact in 1999. The committee tried to promote the decentralization of functions of service from the central government to the local, these 5 local bodies. But at the same time, the law required the government to allocate revenues to these local organizations as well. So, in this sense, I think Thailand is doing quite well in terms of decentralization. In terms of the proportion of income that the central government delegate to the local government, right now is stood at around 29% of total government income, which I think is quite reasonable. Although the laws said that central government have to allocate up to 35%, but at the same time we have to balance between the real delegations of authorities commensurate to financing delegations. So at the moment we are thinking that the plan is already in place. The only question is how fast that we can move to delegate both powers and money. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I might come back to you on the issue of taxation and now that how the taxation reform has moved with the decentralization issue. But going from central government to more municipal authorities, I'd like to maybe address the next question to you, Lauren. You've had a lot of experience as the regional co-director of the Asia Pacific for 100 resilient cities. You've also been a prolific writer on various issues relating to biofuels, trans-boundary water management, climate change issues. So you have the challenges of urbanization that is happening that puts increased pressure on local government to deal not just within the usual challenges of social services, but issues of economic degradation and how to manage that within their planning process. So could you give some insights into that aspect of local government planning?
Sure. Thank you, Farzana, and thank you to the organizers for organizing this event and for inviting me to be here. A bit of context and full disclosure, I was with Asian Development Bank for about 6 years, working first in the climate change unit and then in the Vietnam resident mission. So these topics and also this crowd are not strange to me, and I'm very happy to be here. I think in terms of the urban context, I wanted to just share a few statistics that put this in perspective. In East Asia alone, 200 million people migrated from rural areas to cities between 2001 and 2010. And if that group of cities actually banded together, it would be the 6th largest country in the world. So if we're talking about middle-income countries, we can also talk about middle-income cities. And Farzana, as you said, at a smaller level, these microcosms, these cities, have to deal with the same range of issues that are confronting national governments, but often with much less capacity and with much less funding, and also very rapidly. I think that's the other key thing and key reason that the organization that I work with, 100 Resilient Cities, intervenes at the urban scale and with city governments. Just one more statistic that I did want to share, and it's more of a concept than a number, and it's that while people are very quickly migrating to cities, the most vulnerable urban populations are very often settling in the most disaster-prone areas, because that's where no one else is wanting to live, and that's where we come up with this concept that's been mostly put forward by the International Red Cross of this urban risk divide. The vulnerable are living in those areas that no one else wants to live in. They're more vulnerable than other places. So in terms of creating these economic opportunities, we also have to manage very carefully this risk of the rapid urbanization and creating place, right? Because otherwise, no matter how quickly we're moving, one disaster, whether it's man-made, whether it's environmental, can really set us back. when we're just reaching this middle income status in a city or in a country. So what I'm going to talk about next is a little bit more about an approach that we've been using to help cities to confront these issues and to keep them from stagnating, to keep them from hitting a point of economic growth where they stop, but rather to look longer term. So 100 Resilient Cities, the organization that I'm working with, was established to confront three main trends: climate change, urbanization, and globalization. And in terms of that rapid change, the organization works with cities to develop institutional capacity and also long-range vision. So the first thing that we do with cities is we ask, is there a very committed top-level executive? Is there someone in the city who is motivated to change? And we work with the city to establish a long-range strategy, a strategy over 30 years, which looks deeply at the risks and opportunities that that city faces and helps the city to identify not just where it is, but where it wants to be in a period of 30 years. And having that map and having a process to establish that strategy, which integrates many people, allows the city to look past those immediate needs and to have a forward-looking plan for development. In terms of other opportunities, we also link cities with partnerships, because one of our strongest beliefs is that many of these challenges have been solved in different scales, in different places around the world. So a city, for example, like Mandalay in Myanmar, which is rapidly urbanizing and facing many of the challenges that we've talked about throughout the day, whether it be vulnerability, inadequate housing, inadequate transport, climate stress. Other cities have gone through this planning process before, and there are partnerships, whether it be with organizations like Kim's, like the Asia Foundation, or with MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or others like Microsoft or Veolia. There are partners who have joined us with 100 Resilient Cities to share best practices, so that other key tenet, that other key way to build resilience after institutional capacity, after a long-range strategy, is partnerships and sharing knowledge. And the last thing that we've learned about this approach is to create a network, not a network just of institutions, but a network of people. So 100 Resilient Cities has worked to create the position of a Chief Resilience Officer within each and every city that we work in. That person is charged with being a single point of contact about this longer range vision for a city, that safeguarding of that development vision that is integrated across silos, across departments, and that has buy-in from the top levels of government. And then that Chief Resilience Officer, say in Mandalay, has access to the 99 other Chief Resilience Officers in our network of 100, whether that be in Rotterdam, or whether that be in Melbourne, or whether that be in Santa Fe, Argentina. And so those individuals can share practices together, because we've learned that cities learn very well from each other, sometimes even better than they learn from the best practitioners. So to close, I just wanted to share one example that really looks at creating benefits and an inclusive economy. And it comes from a middle-income country and a city here in region, Da Nang. So Da Nang is a city that has been very planned, that has a green growth plan, a climate plan, and all of these plans brought together different aspects of solving its challenges. But until we worked with Da Nang to look at these initiatives and bring them together under an umbrella resilience strategy, they had a hard time getting those projects from a strategic level to the ground. And within less than a year from releasing the resilience strategy, we've built a community park. And that park may sound small, but a low-income community that did not have any access to public space has now created a green open space where children can play safely, where they can grow a community garden, and where rainwater can be collected. Those multiple benefits, those generate a resilience value. And those kind of projects that are inclusive, that build multiple benefits into a single project or investment are the kinds of projects that can help build resilience and keep countries and cities from stagnating.
Thank you, Lauren. So you've touched on a point that Boonchai also touched on, which is that given that there's a sort of a degree of acceptance that we need to bring government closer to the people in terms of providing services, and with that will come the need for capacity development. I might now take the next question to Kim McQuay, because you've, as a managing director in the Asia Foundation, you have represented the foundation in Thailand and in Bangladesh, and of course you've also worked in Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and Indonesia, so you have a wide range of experience. And in addition, you lead a group of technical specialists that support governments in a whole range of issues, from governance to women's empowerment to economic growth. So maybe you could give some insights into some of the challenges that are faced, maybe more at the local government level. We've had some pointers from the national and the city level, but what about local government?
Sure.
And maybe touch on some of the regional comparisons that you see.
Okay, thanks very much, Farzana. It's a pleasure to be here. A couple of our speakers this morning talked about the existential challenges that are associated with middle-income countries, and for Asia Foundation, we feel that profoundly as an institution as well too, because among the 18 country offices in which we are represented for many years, we have countries at the lowest income levels, many in the middle, and some where we continue to operate in upper income countries, but the real story and the phenomenon is the number of countries that are transitioning through middle income and addressing some of the challenges that we've spoken to today. We have tended to focus particular attention on advanced middle income countries, those that occupy a GNI per capita band in the range of $4,000 to $20,000, so quite significant. So we have 4 in Asia: China, Malaysia, Maldives, and Thailand. We tend to look particularly these days at Malaysia and Thailand. Several more to join over the next few years, and others on the heels. So programmatically, as we look at the challenges that are facing these AMIC countries, both in the context of urban and in decentralization as well too, we tend to look at 2 major challenges that encompass capacity. The first is getting the resources to the local areas, and the second is making smart investments with that money. And by smart investments, we mean thinking about the needs and circumstances of the population as a whole, the many and not the few. We find it useful to approach these 2 challenges through 3 analytical lenses that essentially straddle capacity. So the first is political economy, as we've heard over the course of discussions today, that is always out there as a factor. Pure technical capacity, and then finally the importance of key stakeholders, primarily people in government, but also, as we saw this morning, the private sector, civil society, and other stakeholders, setting and being genuinely guided by strategic direction and articulation of goals. So we'll begin with getting the money out to the local government and passing it through the lens of political economy. We see the phenomenon, I think, is going to be touched on by some other colleagues as well too, so I'll just mention just very, very briefly the phenomenon of places like Bangkok and Kuala Lumpur that tend to dominate the national economy, and some of the statistics related to the greater Bangkok capital region are quite staggering in terms of the scale of public expenditure versus other parts of Thailand. Ideally, the next stages of development would be spreading that wealth that's currently disproportionately concentrated in different places. But the reality is that how the roads are built and other infrastructure created bumps up against this political economy dynamic, and the fact that you have a lot of stakeholders in the cities that have a lot to say about how resources are passing to the other parts of the country, whether it's city corporations or other parts. Here in Thailand, the phenomenon of block grants are a nice illustration of that, where a number of actors at the center continue to wield a lot of influence, and there isn't a lot of corollary capacity developed in terms of local government officials to push back, but even more particularly the community at large and the intended beneficiaries to have a voice on this. We've seen challenges related to the low tax base, especially property taxes, and again, with the challenges of political economy, how much resistance there is to tax reforms. there. And if we don't get those rudimentary building blocks of financing correct, then to be able to move on to some of the more challenging things that are associated with advanced middle income countries, then it's a real problem. In the context of pure technical capacity, even if we get through those political economy issues, we still have situations where local government actors often lack the necessary technical capacity, confidence, and resolve to deal with the financing issues. We sometimes refer to the financing gap in decentralization, but the irony is in a lot of instances there may be far more financing available than is actually taken up by the local authorities, reflecting the fact that governments are not crafting financially viable projects. This is often a capacity issue, the ability of a local government unit to undertake cost-benefit analysis, to conceive and structure the complex financial arrangements that are going to be the hallmark of successful decentralization and that are especially important to the trajectory of advanced middle-income countries. The third lens is vision, and this is essentially an enhancement of capacity. And what we've observed here is how important it is to help local government agencies and officials to think through their overall financial planning policies and practice, to step away from the default tendency to make decisions related to infrastructure and other financing decisions on an ad hoc basis, challenging them really to think in a holistic way about the strategic plans that they're making, not just on a case-by-case or a default transactional issue. Two things are needed in that case. The first is to shift to a more complete, inclusive, and methodical process that aids planning. So that's the capacity side of government. And the corollary is advocacy initiatives on the part of civil society, on the part of the private sector, as we heard this morning, that target and press both national government officials and policymakers, but also the counterparts that are closer at the level of local government to identify and prioritize needs in this more holistic way. So if we get through that first analysis, then we move to, okay, so we get the resources out to the local level. How do we make smart investments? And again, through the three-pronged analysis, the political economy is essentially a similar story that we see at the national level, but how that's played out with the lead actors at the subnational level as well, too. Recently in Nepal, the Asia Foundation conducted a national political economy analysis of local governance that showed that local politics had ceased to be truly oppositional, and that all the different political parties were essentially colluding to capture and guide the allocation of local resources in ways that led to real inefficiencies and didn't reflect the priority needs of the local population. In Mongolia, we recently did a study on local development fund block grant that was used in Ulaanbaatar, and that also showed that while citizen opinions were solicited kind of as an exercise and to say that they had done it, the final projects implemented rarely matched top requests. In the context of capacity, we tend to think about capacities that exist in the system to monitor decisions and implementation. So we're interested in things like local government inspection capacities on things like the building code, compliance and enforcement, as well as systems in place for citizens to engage in oversight and monitoring, to push for that capacity that may be absent. So it's not a matter of citizens simply filling a vacuum that local government doesn't play, but it's actually matching citizen expectations and advocacy calls with strong governance capacity on the part of the local officials. And then finally passing that sensible resource allocation through the lens of vision and this enhanced notion of capacity. We see urban areas in particular, but also decentralized local government as an area of innovation and transformational change. And this is especially important if you look at the experience of countries that have already passed through from advanced middle income country status to upper income status. Those are really the seats of some of the most profound innovations that we've seen. But we bump up against that sort of default mode of not thinking very creatively or out of the box. And that has huge implications for AMIC countries. There are opportunities also to push the capacity of local officials towards reflecting on quality of life dimensions that several of our speakers have referred to today in the context of environment and urbanization. So spanning infrastructure, service delivery, health and education, but even we would say extending to cultural experiences as well too. And interestingly, we've continued to see an abundance of these sort of more traditional infrastructure-led development approaches. If we look at Japan, Korea, Singapore, and even Shanghai and several major cities in China, they're beginning to move away from those conventional approaches in a very encouraging way, placing increasing emphasis on quality of life and livability and how they design their cities. So that's the kind of capacity towards which Asia Foundation, our work in decentralization, is most interested. That's kind of the high water mark, and you still have to do a lot of heavy lifting, beginning with the political economy, and then the technical capacity that's kind of sandwiched in the middle, but all with a view to moving ultimately to this much more thoughtful, holistic approach to styling decentralization policies and their implementation, and also at the urban level as well too. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kim. That was a very comprehensive account of your experiences in capacity development in advanced middle-income countries. And I think what that raises is that some of the challenges that faces advanced middle-income countries are also very similar to the ones that are facing countries at different levels of economic development. And I think you raised another very important point that the path towards capacity development itself might allow for more innovation, because very often local governments are probably the best place to find the solutions to their own problems. And that's quite interesting in the sense that capacity development is not just one way learning process, it's a two-way exercise. But you touched on the issue of the political economy was very important, and there must be a desire and a will to ensure that the local government's capacity is enhanced, and the policies that need to go hand in hand. So I might turn to our last speaker on the issue, to Sakon. You have a lot of experience on the issues of fiscal decentralization. If I could just read, you are a specialist in public finance, fiscal decentralization, and public program evaluation. You're also currently a member of the committees on tax reform and the subcommittees on tax and budget reform and fiscal decentralization, budget and personal transfer to local government. So you certainly have a lot of experience on the hands-on issues in relation to decentralization or deconcentration to local government. But maybe you could give some little bit of insight into the pushes and pulls, because in some countries, as the decentralization process has advanced, there's an increasing push towards re-centralization. Particularly in the areas of tax reform, there's a challenge that local governments, if they're given too much freedom, then it can go out of control. I might also touch base with you on this, Boonchai. But can you give some challenges on the push and pull of decentralization and re-centralization, and what challenges that brings into being able to ensure that services are available to citizens? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction, Farzana, and thank you very much for EDB for inviting me to participate in this forum. And also I have to congratulate for choosing this topic for the forum itself, because when we talk about caught in a trap, normally most people will think about how we're going to move out from the trap. In this case, it means that for Thailand, if we say that Thailand is caught in a trap, how are we going to move our income level or GDP level from the middle income to the higher income? But let me ask this, what is the bottom line of getting out of the middle income trap? It's not just only on the perspective of how the country will have the higher GDP per capita, but I think the bottom line is how we're going to allocate the benefit from the higher income country to distribute the benefit of the higher income level to the rest of the country, particularly to use the benefit of the income to provide better public services and also to provide the better social welfare for the people as well. This is the case for Thailand, because if you look at Fiscal, Thailand have a really successful story in terms of the economic growth. We have, on the average, like maybe some period we have a double digit, and some period we have let's say that quite moderate income growth. The benefit of the income growth in Thailand, you can see from the number of the poverty people measured by the poverty line. Last 20 years, Thailand can lower the number of the poverty people from over 40% of the total population to less than 10%. But in terms of inequality, in terms of the distribution of the benefit, we see a large gap between the regions and the provinces in Thailand. One figure that I'd like to tell you is that, if you look at the figure of the GRP across the region, the richest region get over 30 times of the GRP share over the poorest one. This means the mechanism that we use in our distribution of the benefit from being a middle income cannot be used to distribute the income for the rest of the countries. Thailand, the Thai government understand this problem, so we adopt the decentralization in 1997 after the introduction of the constitution to promote the better public services to local people. And we believe that by using the local government to provide the local public services, it will help us to enhance the social welfare in a better level. Unfortunately, if you look at the mechanism that we use in our decentralization, in the initial state of the decentralization, we devolve public services, particularly on the social welfare related function. Under the initial plan, we distribute about 245 functions to local government. Within that 245 functions, over 100 functions is about social welfare services. So, in terms of providing the better service, we can see that there is an imbalance between the service responsibility and, as you mentioned, the financing. Because by transferring the function, transferring function and the financing, normally by transferring the function is much more difficult than transfer the finance, because you have to amend the law, amend all the regulation related to provide the power for the local government to perform such function. As a result, in Thailand is a good example as well. We can see a lot of local government that some of them have more money than the function responsibility. This is the imbalance that exists in Thailand at the moment. One key issue that we have such condition because of the Thai government use what we call the revenue sharing approach in our decentralizations. Under the revenue sharing approach, it means the government will just simply use the budget and spend some part of the budget as a grant and transfer it to the local governments. Under such system, unfortunately, we do not have a transparent information about the factors that we use in the revenue sharing. So this is the problem that exists in our fiscal decentralization at the moment. In order to ensure the sustainability and better fiscal decentralization, I think, as you mentioned, Farzana, we need to have what we call the tax reform for the local governments. At this moment, we say that Thailand is in the reforming period. By say reforming period, the government should be enhance more fiscal autonomy to local government by allow local government to have more taxing power. Unfortunately, the system that we have at the moment is still under consideration by the National Council. One issue that being considering by the National Council is that how we're going to ensure the sustainability of the fiscal autonomy of the local government in Thailand. I believe that this is rely on the trust by the central government over the local governments, because we never have the experience before in Thailand about how we're going to ensure the responsibility, ensure the efficiency of the public service provision by the local government. If you look at the case of Thailand, probably it's not different from much of the developing countries that introduced the decentralization program. For instance, we have the bad reputation about the performance of the local government, because some say that if we decentralize autonomy or the decision making to the local government, they might have some influence people or the mafia, local mafia control all the decision making in providing the public service. But look it around of the issue in Thailand as well. The case of the corruption or mismanagement of the local government is come from the local people that inform the central government to know the issues. So this means that by decentralized, we also provide the monitoring and the evaluation power to the local people as well. This comes to the point that you mentioned, Farzana, about the conflict between the centralized or decentralized at this moment. We can see, as I mentioned, we can see the distrust of the central government over the local government at this moment. Because if we believe in the performance of the local people, we will be not just only provide the autonomy and the responsibility from the central agency to the local people to make all the decisions by itself. At this moment, the central government just do things that opposite from what we are doing. The central government at this moment is trying to what we call re-centralize the autonomy by set up the budget vertically allocate to the provincial to the regional administration in Thailand. As a result, you have the two parallel systems within the province area. One is managed by the central government through the provincial governor. The other system is through the local governments. This is a two system that is existing at the moment at the provincial level. So that means that if we would like to continue to promote the decentralization, I believe that one key issue is the trust by the central government. We have to make the central government to ensure the efficiency of the performance of the local government. As Michael mentioned, this is a good experience that Thailand would like to learn from the international experience, is that so far the decentralization process in Thailand is existing without any capacity building by the central agencies. All the thing that's been delegated to the local government is being go to the local government without any facilitate or any capacity building mechanism to the local people. As a result, we cannot ensure the full efficiency of the local government in performing its function. So this is the thing that central government have to think about in order to get the most out of the decentralization program. The other thing is that we overshadow the decentralization process. By decentralizing the autonomy to the local people, we believe that the local government or local council will have the autonomy to perform or make their own decision and make best use of its own resources. At this moment, we know that Thailand is in the aging society. This is a big issue for the local government in Thailand because with the aging society at the local level, most of the labor force is not exist at the local level. Most of the young people will move to the urban area. That means most of the labor force of the people in the rural will consist of the young or very young age or the elderly people. That means the lack of the productivity in improve the economic development at the local people. As a result, if we would like to get the most out of the decentralization, I believe that there's a lot of work for the central government in terms of improve the capacity building at the local level, and also have to find a way to reform the revenue system at the local level, particularly the taxing power.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very interesting insight into the experiences that have been faced in Thailand. And I guess all the speakers really were trying to, I guess if I was to summarize, was that there's a need to ensure that we balance accountability with authority, with the resources, including the capacity of local government, in order to ensure that the decentralization process works, in able to ensure that we have effective service delivery. And in particular for the cities, as Lauren pointed out, that the challenges are even more because the concentration of the people over there. I might take this opportunity now to maybe throw the questions to the floor as to whether there would be any questions to the panel from the floor.
As I said, this is a subject close to my heart, so I'm eager to ask the first question. I think one of the things that I want to highlight, in most of the contributions from the speakers it was implicit, but I'd like to highlight something, and that is that in most decentralized systems in our region, the local government setup is actually quite confused in the sense that it comprises two parallel systems quite often. So at the local level you have the elected government proper, and then you have the representation from the central line ministries, which are not part of the official local government system, which are accountable to the central ministries. Now in terms of development planning, the elected local governments on average control something like 10 to 15% of the total budget that is spent at the local level. The rest is still fully controlled by the central government. I'm talking averages here. I don't know the situation in Thailand in particular. So in other words, the degree of fiscal autonomy that elected local governments have in most countries is very, very limited. Mm-hmm. And most of the planning, development planning at the local level is still controlled by the central government. Now, for example, Mike or Lauren, you tend to focus your attention at the local level. But to what extent are you, I'm sure you are aware of the sort of political and fiscal context in which you work, but are you in your programs also part of attempts to renegotiate that, to really try to increase the extent of fiscal autonomy at the local level?
A rich question. I think that there are two ideas I want to leave this forum with. One is that, building resilience helps plan for an uncertain future, and planning projects with resilience benefits means that you're going to have multiple benefits and inclusive growth. And the reason for this is exactly what you just described, Hans. If you are operating in a city and only 10% or 20% or maybe even 30% of that budget is within the control of the mayor or the chief executive of that city, who has a vision for the development of that city, and the rest of that budget is coming through a line ministry, national transport department, who's going to build that national road and deliver your infrastructure. If it's developed without those multiple benefits and that larger vision in mind, you lose out. And you lose out on really the social benefits of that infrastructure or that specific project. So just for one example, in the city of Melbourne that we work very closely with in this region, which you think is a city who's way beyond these planning and these teething concerns. Actually, when we developed the resilience strategy in the city of Melbourne, we found out that it was the first time that the city had looked at integrated transport planning at the metro level in 30 years. Because the city councils are so strong. And in fact, the city of Melbourne is tiny. It's not the whole city of 5 million people, the metro area. It's just the tiny CBD. So even though they could be doing very good planning, if it wasn't integrated with that larger scale, it wasn't doing enough. And similarly here in Bangkok, when we look at the flood control and the transport planning, when we first started the Bangkok Resilience Strategy, the team at BMA, 100,000 people strong, were divided, and those who were working on water management and working on transport management were not connected. And they were less connected to the national authorities who are managing the transport budget, right, and who manage a lot of the public transport and the BTS, etc. However, if you design that differently, if you design that kind of infrastructure with resilience in mind, you can really deliver multiple benefits. And we learned that the hard way in New York City, where I'm from, after Hurricane Sandy. When they gave the project for the redesign of Lower Manhattan and flood control just to the engineers, they came up with a seawall that would have boxed in and blocked the views of everyone who lived on the first to third floors of those Lower Manhattan apartment buildings. And how do you think the communities felt about that? Well, they felt terrible about it. They didn't want to move in there. They had no view anymore for very, very expensive real estate. They then turned this design process over to some colleagues of mine who run a resilience building project process. And they brought architects in, they brought the communities in, they brought in some very talented Dutch water engineers from Arcadis and Deltares, some of our partner organizations. And what they came up with was multiple plans for parks, for natural absorption, and for oyster beds along Lower Manhattan. So not only is the community now green and the views are preserved, people have recreation space, they have flood control, and they have really good cheap oysters in season.
So, I mean, Lauren, you talked about the autonomy on being able to manage expenditures on the expenditure side. So, Hans, you mentioned that there's 20 to 30% of budget allocation is given to local governments, and to what extent should they have the autonomy to spend that money? I might sort of refer the question back to Boonchai on the issue of revenue. On the revenue side, there's equally the challenge of how much autonomy do we give local governments in order to raise revenue themselves, because this is where the push and pull that you talked about as well, Sakon, in terms of the central government wanting to take back control.
Let me answer first.
If I could just try with Boonchai first, and I'll come back to you on this one. So Boonchai, can you give some insights into that? What's happening in Thailand on that issue?
Yes, if you look at the figures of last year, about 16% of local government revenues came from their own tax revenues. About 48% were shared tax and shared revenues. And the rest 36% come from government transfers. So if we look only the own tax revenue that local government collect, is increasing every year. So it means that the local government at least have autonomy in some sense to expand their tax base, to increase their tax adjustment, to increase their fees of service or something like that. So in this sense, I think so far the local governments in Thailand doing quite well. But again, we have to speed up the more autonomies to the local governments. And I understand that right now they are discussing about how to increase the process of decentralization, as well as the delegations of revenue autonomy to the local government, which was discussed yesterday, but I didn't follow that so far. But they have the plan to overhaul the current acts to make it more speedy. Thank you.
Sakon, did you want to?
Yeah, okay. As Boonchai mentioned that about the figures of the local revenue, I think maybe the figure itself maybe provide as a mislead information, because with the total figure that Boonchai mentioned about that, if you have to look in detail about the type of the revenue that we talk about, even though look at the number of the revenue that local government receive from each annual budget, the figure is increasing every year, starting from the less than 20% to right now at this moment, if I'm not wrong, it's close to 30% of the government income. But within that 29% of the total local revenue compared to the central, you will have to look inside each type of the local revenue itself, particularly the grant or the tax transfer. Many of them come with the condition. For instance, some of the grants only have the condition that you use it just for the pension, for the certain type of the expenditure. That means by using the revenue sharing, as I mentioned, it may not tell us the whole story. You have to look at the actual autonomy or actual power of the local government in using that money for that to support its own spending. Similar the case of Hans' question. In Thailand, we also have such problem as well. In the past, before we transfer the budget to the local, the centralized agency usually be the one who make all the decision of where the money will go, how the money will be spent. But right after we have the decentralization, the same portion of budget in the past is made the decision by a single unit of the centralized agency. Now it will spread to over 7,000 units of local government. So that means that with the whole chunk of the money, maybe over 10 billion baht or something, been distributed to over 7,800 units of local government. So that means the size of the budget that been allocated to the revenue channel is being divided. As I say that, at the moment we have no information or have no mechanism to use in our revenue sharing. As a result, some local government have the function to perform, but with the limited resources that come from the revenue sharing approach, they may not perform the function efficiently.
Okay. Thank you for that insight. Kim, you wanted to add, and maybe you could give some insights as to, I mean, one of the questions that was raised on the floor was that some local governments, in spite of having equal amounts of revenue as others, or equal amounts of capacity, well, not so much capacity, but revenue to allocated by the central government to deliver services, perform better than others. So can you give some insight there?
Sure. I'll just start with just one additional point that relates to Thailand, and that is sort of among many additional innovations is, and this is for a couple of years, the Asia Foundation did a project here when I was country rep looking at fiscal decentralization. We looked first sort of at the national level, policy response, and kind of advocacy masquerading as a discourse between different stakeholders. And then we also looked at the local tax base, and we looked as the third piece, not quite in desperation, but it seemed like an interesting third angle, and that was the ability of local governments to raise resources through commercial-like enterprises. And that's, I'm not sure how that sort of maps out over other Asian contexts, but certainly in Thailand that's an interesting challenge as well too, because the prohibitions are very strict on that, whereas in a lot of instances a local government authority could take on something related to sort of to farm out waste removal or things of that kind on a commercial basis, but the parameters are very tight here in Thailand. On the issue of these differences in performance, and there's a lot of reasons related to that in terms of the sort of the size of the local government units relative to the resources that reach them. In a number of countries, including some where there hasn't been sort of a strong national policy commitment to decentralization, we've still managed to sow some interesting kind of reflection on the performance of different bodies through provincial competitive indexing and things of that kind. We did it in Vietnam a few years ago. We didn't know exactly what to expect when we embarked on this adventure, but in the end we ended up put the information out in a very candid way. We're using spider diagrams and all sorts of things to compare the different dimensions of competitiveness amongst these different provinces. And at first, a lot of the provincial governors and others that were involved in this kind of pushed back pretty aggressively, and so there must be a problem with the statistics or whatever. But in the end, human nature kicked in, and that kind of competitiveness phenomenon we saw, and it was very interesting to see how a number of the different local government bodies kind of took that information and made some significant changes in response to it. So it was, and I think what sort of the lesson from that is, you can have the political economy discourse, you can come at the problem from a lot of different dimensions, but often the empirical evidence speaks loads, and if it's well done, it's very difficult to argue with the empirical basis, and that can really spark some interesting reform innovations and responses on the part of local authorities, and ultimately on the part of national policymakers as well.
The issue of performance is quite interesting, because I did some work on Indonesia about the performance of local government, and then the challenge was that, okay, if local governments are not performing well in service delivery, do you penalize them, or is it a cry for more capacity development to take place? Because at the end of the day, do you want to penalize the average citizen for the incompetence of the government, local government? So whether these indices on performance actually help make the right allocated decisions is something that I think is still a challenge. And one of the things is the stress on accountability of the local government to the people was almost more important than the issue of comparison of performance. So it's an interesting debate nonetheless. One of the questions that has been raised, and I'd like to address this to you, on the question of the private sector. Okay, so you dealing with cities, and so there has to be some, I mean there ought to be, and obviously has been some interaction with the private sector. So where do you see the role of the private sector in the issue of building resilience of local government on issues of infrastructure, investments, and how important a role do they play?
The private sector is critical in building resilience, and one of the things I mentioned when I used the Hurricane Sandy example was the technical expertise that was accessed by the City of New York in planning that response. Now, we are aware as an organization that the City of New York can probably access that technical expertise and pay for it. But there are many cities in the 100 Resilient Cities Network, Mandalay that I mentioned earlier, Can Tho in Vietnam, Da Nang, who can afford to pay for that kind of professional expertise to advise them in a design process. Other cities, even advanced cities, may have such intricate procurement regulations that getting advice on how to design a bidding document is beyond their capacity because it would just take too long or there would be a conflict of interest perceived. So one of the things that we've been very intentional in doing it and is quite unique to our program is signing up, as I mentioned earlier, about 100 organizations who are donating services to the cities in our program. And it's beneficial because the cities can then get the advice on how to ask the right questions and design the right projects up front. At the end of the day, this comes back to planning. Planning in a more holistic and intentional way so that your projects can deliver multiple benefits. That's resilience value. So the private sector and the knowledge, the know-how that they've accumulated in doing this is critical to that. We've made it easier for cities to access that knowledge through a platform of partnerships. And the private sector is doing it for free, but I would say for free in quotes. Because for them, this is actually extremely valuable R&D. What they get to do is they get to build a relationship with some of the most dynamic cities in the world and their chief executives and these new chief resilience officers, people who they know are accountable. And I think we've all talked about accountability as one of the most frustrating factors in continuing successful development. So they develop a relationship with these cities, with accountable individuals, and they actually get to then trial their services, their knowledge into that city and understand more of what cities like our cities need, and then they can develop products that respond to those needs. So it's really a win-win where the private sector comes in, helps cities to build resilience on a one-off basis, and then they can develop products that build resilience, and thereby, as an organization with our cities, we're driving a marketplace and creating a marketplace for resilience products. So the private sector is really, really critical to building resilience.
Thank you. Boonchai, could you just maybe just reflect on that a little bit in terms of what has the government of Thailand, what is its policy towards maybe creating more enabling environment for the private sector to operate at the local government level? So there's greater degree of partnership or cooperation at the minimal that can exist between local government and the private sector, so that the revenue challenges that you face can actually partly be met by the private sector investment.
Actually, at the Ministry of Finance, at the government level, we are trying to promote our business-friendly environment. You may recall that the World Bank Ease of Doing Business ranking for Thailand is quite stagnant during the past few years. But under the current government, they try to speed up the regulations in terms of business environment, not only in the city, but also throughout the country. And they aim that with these kinds of reform, with these kinds of deregulations, doing business in Thailand will be more friendly and easy and cost-saving. So in that sense, I understand that with this reform, not only the Ministry of Finance, but every ministerial concern will have to adjust. And this will be the best for private sectors to do business. But again, it's quite normal for the business to do business close to the market, which means the city, rather than rural areas. That's why we need to have the government to intervene in some sense. For example, we set up tax incentive for investors to invest in certain areas of the countries, to bring in more private investment. For example, some area that we share the border with our neighboring countries. So that's the prime policy to drive investment in rural areas. And on top of that, I think the government themselves would like to reform the tax to make it more increase in terms of tax collections. Right now in Thailand we collect tax as about 17-18% of GDP, which is quite high in terms of middle income countries, but still below what the SDGs require, which is about 20% of tax collection compared to GDP. Under the tax reform, we aim that, but it's not easy. Frankly speaking, it's not easy to raise tax. This must be depend on the economic situation as well. In terms of the local government, which I still insist that it's quite important for them to do some service instead of the central government. The government not deny that we have to increase financial contribution to local governments, but at the same time, we have to understand that local government themselves sometimes they cannot provide the service effectively. For example, in the area of education, the areas of healthcare, this is quite a problem for the government. Why I said that? If you look at the figures of the local governments accumulate unused fund they have now so far, we're talking about $15 billion deposit in the bank account or something like that and unused. So in terms of fiscal management, we want to see those money to be utilized for the local people in terms of investment, in terms of better services for the local people. But so far we still have such kind of problem. So sometimes it's quite difficult to justify why you have to put more proportions to local governments, why they cannot serve the community. That's why we have to balance between financing and the functions altogether. Thank you.
Right. I think Boonchai, thank you. I think Indonesia had the same problem, but related to a different issue when they introduced very tight governance laws, and as a result, the local government was very hesitant about spending the money. Kim, can you get some insights into how that issue was resolved, or how we can deal with the issue of the fact that we want to give local governments increasing amount of capacity in terms of financial resources, but then you have what you see in Thailand today, where there's money is unspent. And this, I would say, a big is capacity issues, perhaps. How can one get out of that?
Sure. I think in the Thailand context, since we don't have, and are arguably unlikely, sort of in the foreseeable political future, to have a very strong national policy commitment towards decentralization of the kind that we saw in the Philippines in the 1980s and 1990s, and later in Indonesia during my time there. So in a sense, that's, in an ideal world, one would like to work within a policy framework. But when you don't have that policy framework, what it tells us, I think, at the foundation is that there's scope for experiment. And rather than trying to push for a wholesale change of some of these issues, if you can create space to experiment with select local government authorities, often with the approval of the national government authorities as well too, then you can get at this kind of tension that you alluded to, Farzana, between a desire on the part of local authorities to command more authority and more resources that bumps up against the capacity issues. And so I think that's really the sort of the secret sauce, in a sense, in this particular context, at least speaking to Thailand, and the approach that we've taken is to work with a select group of actors, but also to bring in a relatively broad array of other stakeholders as well too, as part of the dialogue. So you're not dealing with a limited number of actors, but bring in academic partners, policy think tanks, and others to sort of to be part of this and to document whatever it is that you're doing. We've used tools such as strategy testing, attribution analysis, and things of that kind that try to understand within the context of a program intervention, is the intervention making a difference, or is the whole combination of other politics and things that are at play as well too. So those are some of the tools that we've used here and in other places.
I've just been given the signal that we're probably, our time is up for the session. I think if I was to summarize from the discussions that have taken place, I think there's an overall conclusion that local governments need to be strengthened in order to ensure capacity development and delivery of services to people. There's no question about that. It's a question of how quickly we can get there and how do we balance the various challenges of revenue and expenditure management, capacity issues. But I think, Lauren, you pointed, gave some good examples of situations where, that combination has worked and things are happening and people are getting good service delivery. But the challenges are nevertheless there, and it will have to be a continuous case of learning by doing. And what we see in Asia, of course, is slight differences in countries where they have come together. Countries like China or India have come together where they were decentralized entities. They came together as one country. And countries like Thailand and Indonesia, which are then decentralizing from the top down. And there are lots of cultural and social issues related to that. But nonetheless, the local governments are here to stay, and the local governments have to be supported, and in some ways a solution has to be found which are unique to different contexts in order to ensure that service delivery takes place. So thank you very much to Boonchai, to Lauren, to Kim, and to Sakon for your contributions. It was very interesting. We covered a range of issues. We didn't necessarily answer all the questions, but nevertheless, I think they will give plenty of food for thought taking forward. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've covered the end of our program. And we started the program by highlighting the cooperation between ADB, IED, and Thammasat University, which really has been exemplary. I would like to close the program. I would like to invite the Dean of the Economics Faculty of Thammasat University to provide his closing remarks.
Delegates, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to give the closing remark of this conference. It is always difficult to be the last one to speak, especially it means that I'll delay your cocktail too. Okay, but I'll try to make it short. As a representative of Faculty of Economics, Thammasat University, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to co-organize this event together with Asian Development Bank. Altogether, this is the first time we have joined forces in organizing such a conference. I think the event was a great success. The term middle income trap has gained prominent among academics and policy makers in recent years. The term refers to the situation in which a country's growth slows after reaching middle income levels. The heightened interest in the issue is understandable, given about half of the countries in the world, including Asia, Thailand, are still middle income countries. Growth slowdown in the world market coincides with the point where the pool of transferable unskilled labor is exhausted, so that productivity growth in Asia due to shifting additional workers to industry from agriculture and from technological catch-up is diminishing. International competitiveness is eroded and output growth slowdowns. Previous conditions that enable rapid growth in the region, which are robust international trade with Europe and United States, a large working age population and strong demand for labor-intensive manufacturing sectors are now retreating. Vulnerability to exogenous shocks, rising inequality, and continued environmental degradation are also the challenge for middle-income countries. Today we have heard many ideas on structural reform priority from middle-income country. To avoid the dread middle-income trap from our distinguished speakers, starting from educational reform, promoting private sector development, employment creation, regional cooperation, safeguarding against further environmental degradation, and the important role of sustainable governance and local government issue, which are raised by our speakers. Sustainable growth toward high income level must be increasingly characterized by relatively abundance of human capital and availability of technological and managerial resources. How to move from resource-driven growth to growth based on high productivity and innovation. Private sector plays very crucial role. The private sector is the generator of innovation, wealth, and most employment in the market economy. But unleashing the innovation, expertise, and financial resources of the private sector will require essential upfront work to enable the required structural transformation of economies. Public and private sector need to work together. The private sector doesn't operate in vacuum and needs to be supported by a policy mix that enables it to unleash its potential. Ensuring a fair regulatory environment, fostering entrepreneurship, removing barriers to trade, and safeguarding recent labor conditions are necessary to promote private sector development. Building a high-quality education system together to promote responsive to modern institutions are also required to support competition, innovation for the private sector. Regional cooperation is another aspect that our speaker mentioned, which could strengthen economic development in the region. International trade with Europe and United States are retreating recently. We have seen protectionism movement and anti-globalization tendency that could undermine growth in the Asia and Pacific region. Stronger regional integration or South-South cooperation is even more important, not only in terms of trade and investment, but also in terms of infrastructure, connectivity, energy cooperation, as well as climate change mitigation and environmental preservation. Affordable solutions are now available to enable countries to leapfrog toward cleaner, more resilient and sustainable economies. More countries are switching to renewable energy and a range of other measures that will reduce emission and increase adaptation efforts. But climate change is a global challenge that does not respect national boundary. Emission anywhere can affect people around the globe. It is an issue that requires solutions that need to be coordinated at the international level. Developed nations must take responsibility for their historic emission and contribute to the fund and transfer of technology to the developing countries needed to help avoid dangerous climate change. For the last session, our distinguished speakers point to the importance of subnational governance in developing planning on the inclusive growth. While decentralization has been a global phenomenon for decades, decentralization development in Asia Pacific have had certain distinct characteristics in terms of both context of substance. For example, small tax burdens, large tax base, as well as unparalleled urbanization. These characteristics provide a wide palette of challenges and opportunity for the efficacy of subnational government in the region addressed by our speakers. Delegates, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, today we have had a fruitful discussion throughout the event. On behalf of the organizer of the event, I would like to thank all distinguished speakers and panel members. Their presence has been invaluable and without any doubt has helped make the event a great success. Thank you.